and welcome to another episode of Frame and Reference. I'm your host, Kenny McMillan, and today we're talking with Charles Papert, the DP of Key & Peele. I actually first heard of Charles, as a person, through the DVX user forums, of which I am a member, and so is he, and he would post lighting breakdowns from Key & Peele. But I always was interested in talking to him because of that, but never reached out. And then he reached out to me, and he said he liked the podcast, and we might have an interesting, fun conversation, and we did. So nothing to sell here. This is just two DPs having a good time talking about the work, the life, and everything in between. I'll let you get to it. Please enjoy my conversation with Charles Papert. I personally find the transition from analog to digital very interesting, and picking the brains of people who were working through that change. Because when I graduated college in 2012, and so by that time, pretty much everyone had flipped over to the 5D at the indie level, weren't using DVXs anymore. Obviously the Red had just come out. So I shot 16 millimeter before I went to college, like at a film school, like a New York Film Academy. So I found that experience very edifying. And I definitely carried it into my digital work or that workflow, I suppose. But I do find that transition period very interesting, and I like talking about it. So like when people talk about, I was in the dark room all the time, like I got to do that in college.
Right.
So maybe more fun because I had a little bit more wits about me than a 13-year-old, but
yeah. But still, you didn't do it under the pressure of a professional environment or the deadlines. And I mean, not that college doesn't have its own pressure, but when it's the tools of your trade and you're forced into using that's something we can definitely talk about, because I started in a 3/4 inch tape. Well, I started fucking around with VHS, but professionally, I had a period of shooting, editing, producing local commercials on 3/4 inch tape to tape, and boy, did I learn a lot from that. So we can definitely talk about that part of it.
Yeah,
and how that impacts now, because it really does. It gives me a different mentality.
Yeah, because we'll just roll into it, because you had or have had a pretty storied career. You've worked pretty much in all facets of filming. I don't even want to say the industry, because at this point it's many industries. Doing industrials and television stuff are all closely related. But it's like people, hey, can you shoot me a TikTok? I'm like, I don't know if I can. Well, you do video. It's different.
It really is.
Transitions.
I agree. Yeah, I think there's 12-year-olds doing things in that medium that I can't do. I just a friend of mine posted on Facebook recently about their length of time, how the length of education they had learning Avid and using Avid professionally, and they cannot figure out the TikTok editor.
Yeah.
I'm like, that says a lot, because it's working in a different mentality than our brains. I'm not good with any of those sort of newer simplified video editors. They don't work my brain the same way my brain does.
I just recently saw I don't want to call it a study, but it was an article. And it said that people who are about my age, who grew up sort of during the peak of the early internet, when you still had to tinker and figure everything out to get through it, are more technologically literate than Gen Z, because Gen Z has been primarily brought up on iPhones and simplification and not tinkering. So Gen Z seems to be about as literate as the boomers, according to this article. And X and millennials are more in that, like, we used to build our own stuff, whether online or not, the forum eras, which we can talk about. And so I think that's it. I mean, I saw recently a Reddit thread where this guy was like, I saw on TikTok that I should be using, I'm making this up, but it was like something like Allegiant Editor. Is that better than Premiere? And we were like, what the hell is that? Because you pop open Premiere and it's confusing as shit if you don't have the industrial knowledge.
Right. True. Yeah. Or the time and energy to learn it, because I think a lot of it, the learning curve is, if it can't be explained in a single YouTube video, I don't want it.
Right.
And all the legit software out there is so deep that I mean, I've been using Photoshop hardcore for over 20 years. I probably only scratch about 10% of it at best.
Yeah.
And if I look at a tutorial online, I'm like, apparently I don't know how to use this at all. I can
Have you
get
been
the,
doing
you know,
Have you been doing anything? This just happened to me recently where I was like, man, I just wish there was a tool to do something. And I Googled it. And sure enough, there's like in the last update, they're like, we just added this. Like recently, they added sky replacement in
oh, did they?
Photoshop. It has its own sky replacement.
Okay. Yeah.
It's got its own, all the AI tools, AI upscaler, all these
Yeah.
things that like content aware scale.
Yeah. My feeling about it is that Adobe realized they were getting their ass handed to them technologically by $3 apps on that you could buy that literally, because I have friends who will go on their phone and go boom, 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 make a funny little comp, and I'm like, I can do that, but it's going to take me an hour. So
Yeah.
it's like, so Adobe's like, yeah, I guess we're going to have to put that simplified AI stuff in there, AI stuff instead of, in addition to all the old methods. And yeah, you're right. I didn't know there was a sky replacement tool. I'll have to go look at that. Sounds great.
It's like literally in a drop down anyway.
Yeah.
But I wanted to talk about the tape era.
Yeah.
Were you doing like you weren't doing like VHS to VHS? Were you digitizing at that point?
Oh God, no. That term didn't even exist. I mean, I started playing around in the whatever the math would be. I guess late '70s when I was in grade school. Tape to tape, for sure. Originally, half-inch black and white reel to reel was the first system I used. Which the methodology for making an edit on that was you'd line up the two decks, and you would take in my mind it was a grease pencil, but it could have been a felt tip, and you would mark X's on the back of the tape at certain points, and then you'd wind back, put another X, wind it back some more, put another X, hit play on one, watch for the X's, and go 3, 2, 1, and then click, and then you jam it into record. It was like a manual countdown. I mean, what? But
Right.
it got better, but there was always issues. I mean, VHS to VHS, you could make one generation down of dub and you'd lose a bunch of quality, and then you'd make a copy of that and it was looking terrible. So it was almost pointless. But professionally, I got a job working at a production company in my early 20s, and it was 3/4 inch. Again, all tape to tape, again, pre-digital era. And again, marginally better, but now I was working under a deadline.
Right.
This was a tiny company. They would hand me a script. I would go out and shoot it with one or two other people helping me, direct it, shoot it. I mean, I'd read the script and go, okay, I'll figure out what to do with that, come back and edit it, and it would be on the air 2 days later, which was an incredible boot camp for me to learn how to basically the advantages there was I learned very quickly how not to frustrate myself as an editor. So the shooter part of me was like, oh, I got it. Especially shooting B-roll, I learned the basic rule of B-roll, which is start on one thing, count to a certain number of seconds, make your move to the next thing, and then count for a certain number of seconds, giving you 3 separate clips, right? 2 statics with a move in between them, because everyone else just sort of moves around the camera, and then you're sitting there like grabbing the very last frame you can. I mean, that kind of stuff still to this day is advice that I'll give operators if they're grabbing things. I'm like, no, you're not. You got to hold at either end of that move,
That's the amount of, because you're an online individual. We know this. Have you seen I have a theory that this huge current push on YouTube and whatnot, or let's say popular video, towards B-roll. Everything is there's no more A-roll. B-roll is the new A-roll.
Right.
My theory is that because no one has a script, no one has a story to tell, they're like, well, I can make this pretty. And so they just make some pretty stuff, most of them are photographers, right? They get like a DSLR,
Right.
They shoot photos, they figure that out, and then they're like, oh, this is a video mode.
Right.
Do you think that's had a first of all, any other tips about shooting B-roll from seeing those that you have, or do you think those are cool and new, or are they kind of annoying?
Well, I mean, look, everything cool and new is annoying. No.
Fair? Yeah, yeah.
No, it's not. But it's funny when you've been around for a few cycles and what's cool and new is something you did yourself 20 years ago and you saw it go in and out of a trend and then it comes
Sure.
back around again. A lot of the popularity of vintage lenses now is a little bit of a head scratcher to me. There are lenses that I was like, thank God we have something better now that has replaced that. I'll never use that lens again. Bye bye. And I'm like, wow,
Mm,
that's the cool thing now, and it's worth 4 times as much as it was when no one wanted it 12 years ago.
yeah.
I keep a little mental list of things that haven't yet come back to go. I should start reintroducing this into my work to see if I can kickstart that trend. Like Dutching. Dutching was huge in the 90s. It hasn't truly come back yet. It's probably about to. And the next person that
Format.
does it, it's all what?
I would guess one reason format.
Oh,
If
format.
everyone's watching
Not by
vertically,
16. Yeah,
you
but
can't.
sure.
I
You
suppose
could. There's no reason
shoot
you
wide
could.
enough, I guess.
Yeah, it's just more that early 90s MTV vibe where you could not just so much the videos, but the interviews and the BTS and all that. It was a hilarious thing as I did some stringing for VH1 and MTV back in those days. And you'd have the Betacam on your shoulder, you'd hit record, someone would say action, and you instantly just start throwing your body around up and down, pushing in and out, and everything rolling on the shoulder.
Rap videos
Um,
still do that.
yeah, not to the. I mean, I have some old tapes, and I laugh at them when I watch them. I go, "Yeah, that's such the look of its time." So, yeah, there's been a couple of things that I've done over the recent years where we've wanted to do a little bit of a callback, and I've had to coach the operators into what was the look from back then, and it's very against the grain for some of them to be able to, like a Steadicam operator, when they're just rock and rolling. I'm like, yeah, have fun with the third axis, roll that shit, and you realize that there's nuances to it, that it is not automatic, especially if you're unlearning in a way. A version of that I was never good at myself was sort of a mockumentary, a faux doc look a la The
Right.
Office. It's an incredible skill to be able to shoot like you don't know what the next thing happening is. The easy version of that is when someone starts dialogue, don't hinge to them before they start, waiting to hear them and then go find them. But the snap zoom part, to make it truly look organic and do a great job at it, you can't teach it. You just have to
Right.
some people are just really good at it. It did come up in a show where we did a momentary parody of The Office, and it didn't feel right. I couldn't articulate what about it because I just didn't have that within myself. If I picked up the camera, I couldn't do a better job. And when I
Right.
saw it cut together, yeah, it didn't quite work. We didn't nail it.
I interviewed the DP of Parks and Rec, and he also shot some of The Office. And if I recall correctly, I could be making this up, but if I recall correctly, we were kind of talking about how the camera person is not only also kind of an actor, but also kind of needs to have great comedic timing. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's where the zooms come, is like when you
Yes.
know that beat has been hit and then you snap it as the punctuation, which turned into, if you watch, going back to what these damn kids are doing, TikTok, Instagram videos, whatever, they all, because they've been watching The Office for a decade, right? Those punch zooms, the little 2-finger punch zooms, I see it all the time. And I'm like, that is a visual language that strictly comes from The Office or like A Mighty Wind or whatever,
Yeah.
like all those early mockumentaries.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it has become a huge part of vocabulary, and 100% it is. It's you have to understand the joke to know how to punctuate it. And where does the snap come in? Does it come during the joke, immediately after the joke? Do you give it a beat or a half beat for awkwardness and to let it sink in before you snap? What's the speed of the snap? Is it in two pieces? There's so many tiny facets to it, and you can really make the joke land with that camera move. And I actually, probably more than any other type of operating that I can imagine. There's I do have a good sense of moving camera and how like a dolly cam or a steady cam, a smooth move that's kind of like a slow drift, how that can impact and help or hurt a joke.
Right.
There is a thing about having a moving shot that comes to a dead stop that's like a needle scratch moment, to use another dated reference.
Yeah.
Um, and if you keep moving through a joke, you can actually hurt that punch, So that's something that comes up much more often in the type of stuff that we shoot, which I find really interesting. I really love the idea of our end of it, the cinematography end of it, being a complement to comedy.
Yeah. I actually, I will get back into comedy, but I have a terrible memory and I'm also quite scatterbrained. So, I did want to ask, when you were saying that you were like stringing and whatnot earlier, what was kind of that industrial cinematography like, functionally? Like when you were going out with a couple people, like how were you handling lighting? Were you lighting? Were you just looking for like good positions, or what? How did that kind of come about mechanically?
Well, first of all, yeah, this is going back a good ways. That when I was working at that job, the cameras that we're using, the video cameras, were tube cameras,
Mm,
Plemicon, Satacon, the old tech before solid state chips, and they needed a lot more light. They were definitely not 800. They weren't even 500. They were generally more like 250, 320 ASA. So of course we had to light them a lot. If you think back to sort of the classic television studios years ago, they were pounding light in there because the tubes were very hungry. Yes, everything had to be lit. Everything was hot lights, of course. And I learned a lot about lighting in that era. In fact, a tremendous that again, those couple of years, even though much of what I was shooting was god awful, and now I watch it and I just laugh my ass off because they're local commercials in a
right.
small market. I mean, most of them were the guy who owned the company screaming at the camera, "Come on down," kind of thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But every now and then I would sneak in a good one. Usually, if they allowed me to write one, I would create some magnum opus. I'd take 3 times too long shooting it. My boss would yell at me and then put it on the company demo reel.
Right.
And I look back at those and I go, yeah, that is a kid really trying to punch above his class, and be a filmmaker, using very limited tools. And I was all about, how do I make 3/4 inch video look filmic?
Right.
We had, I'm getting away from lighting for a sec, but we'll get back into it. We had one box that was like a frame grabber, a frame store, which I discovered that if you push one button on it, it would drop every other field of video. So instead of 60i, it became essentially 30i, which
Copy.
has the cadence much more of film than 60i did, right? And I was like,
Right.
this is our magic bullet. This is how we're going to create spots that look filmic, right? And I was
Mm,
using pro mists and nets, and I wasn't the only one doing this, of course, but in a small market, we were starting to, our boss was starting to sell this look to clients. He was like, we have
sure.
this is what we're the only ones in the area doing this shit, because no one was going to pay for film. I mean,
We bought a filter.
yeah, exactly. But it's that and camera moves and all the other thing, and long lens, of course, shooting wide open on these broadcast lenses. I was just doing everything I could, and it's kind of fun to have to work with such limited tools and torture them into doing something they were never meant to do.
I agree.
Video engineers probably tore their hair out when we turned this stuff in, because that's what they loved to do in those days, was try to find anything wrong. But
Right.
and I'm like, no, everything's right. It's the other way around, dude. Take a look at it. It looks great. Yeah, but on the scope it says, I'm like, oh, damn it.
Yeah. I remember the DVX era, the same thing happening, where because you had that built-in lens, the cinematography teachers are always like, stand as far back as you can and zoom in. And we were like, okay, because that's how you got the shallow depth of field.
Yeah.
Or you bought the crazy adapters, the lettuce or the black.
Yeah, the Mini
Red
35
Rock Micro. Yeah, yeah, the
Yep.
Mini 35. Yeah.
I did a lot of stuff with the Mini 35. That was a hot trend for a minute. I had one of those.
Yeah.
And XL1. I love that combo. And then
I still have my XL2
oh, look at you.
right over there. Yeah.
Love it. Love that camera.
They should bring it back. Just put a better chip in it.
You're right. They probably should. I mean, yeah, that body with a Super 35 chip would be really fun to own, wouldn't it? In its own weird way. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a terrible form factor. That was the beginning of the
I
bad
loved
form
it.
factors. Did you?
I found it very. It had a top handle. It had an eyepiece. It was
Yep,
very
it's
ENG, but it felt right. I don't know. Maybe it's just because it was like the first professional camera I had, but
Well, yeah, I mean, I shouldn't say it was terrible. A lot worse things happened after that. At least you could bump it up against your shoulder.
Yeah.
Everything after that, like the DVX, you held in your hands in front of you. And I grew up on shoulder mounted cameras, so yeah, I had a very specific feeling about that. But yeah, I mean, I shouldn't say terrible. It was a wonderful camera, and it actually, I will say that it was.
They're not listening. It's fine. You can.
Oh yeah, no, but I do take it back. It's one of my favorite cameras that I own because the emotional attachment I have to it was buying that camera in the late '90s, and then getting Final Cut Pro 1. I realized that I had the guts to be able to make films myself, with some reasonable degree of accomplishment visually. That it wasn't just sort of this half-assed. There's nothing really filmic about that. No, you actually could. You could go use frame mode. I could edit it.
It had
at home
24p. The XL2.
Oh, the XL2 had 24p. Okay,
that was a big selling point.
So it improved on the frame mode from the XL1, did it?
Yeah, because 28 days later, shot on XL1S's, and they had to
convert.
They got PAL versions because it had a higher resolution by whatever it was, 20 lines.
Yeah.
And then had to drop frames or something, do a pull down. As far as I'm aware.
God bless him. Yeah, I remember watching that movie and being fascinated with it, although there were shots that I was like, I can't actually figure out what's happening in this shot because there just isn't enough resolution.
A little blown out.
Yeah, by today's standards. It's interesting looking back at I'm because I started in video and then when I moved out to LA, everything was film. I went from we're jumping a little bit, but my period after working at that production company, the next 10 years I worked in Boston as a Steadicam operator and as a DP, and my workload was probably 60-70% beta type shooting, and the rest of it was film, either 16 or 35, but all ARRI, for instance, because we were in a small market. And then I started getting work out of town as a Steadicam operator, and it was suddenly I'm working with Panavision cameras and things are very exciting. Moved to LA, and that's all it was. It was just like the high end, gear. And I thought, okay, that's it. Bye-bye to video. Right. And then 12, 15 years later, it's creeping back in, and then it goes completely, everything that I had learned was still applicable back in the day. And for people who were having a hard time because I'd only come up in film, I had a little bit of a nudge there because I wasn't scared at all. The F900 was a very comfortable camera for me to get into.
That camera, we need to give George Lucas a little more credit for what he's done for the industry. Maybe he didn't make your favorite film, but not
just maybe, definitely, but yes, he was. Yes, the making that push to digital was definitely he's a large part of that, and inspiring Panavision to go that direction, and then ultimately come up with the Genesis, which of course was the first truly legit, I think, cinema camera, digital cinema camera.
And a lot of stuff was shot on that Genesis, like a lot.
Yeah, I got to work on one of the early films with it, maybe number 5 or something, and as an operator, and it was really fascinating. It was everything was wild and woolly. Each team was talking to the net. We'd call up the ACs from the previous movie, the guys from Apocalypto, and say, "What'd you do with this? How'd you do that?" It was pretty weird to go from a very legitimate, mature workflow with film to this haphazard, ad hoc. Well, we need to put the recorder in a backpack. So we buy a camping backpack. Well, it's overheating. We'll just leave it unzipped. And we're making, a studio feature with this weird hodgepodge of equipment. There was something kind of exciting and fun about it. And again, I just, having had that background in video, it hurt a lot of people's heads. And I was kind of like enjoying pulling them from my youth, Yeah. But ultimately, it was really a pain in the ass. Certainly, as an operator, you lost the eyepiece that was the best seat in the house with film became the worst seat in the house for a number of years there. The early cameras were black and white. They were tiny little chips or tubes in there. And you just went, well, I can't see shit anymore. Right. So that kind of thing, as a Steadicam operator, those early cameras, we called that camera the Genocide. because it was so heavy. And it wasn't until the Alexa that things settled down and got really good.
Right.
And that's almost exactly the time when I moved up to DPing and I didn't have to carry them around anymore.
Oh, that's nice. Actually, that's a perfect segue to that question I asked a little bit ago. I swear to God, we won't jump around this much. But how did lighting for tube cameras and all that sort of translate over to lighting for something like the Genesis? Because film lighting, or all three, just like if you could touch on that little triangle, because obviously where you put the lights doesn't really change, but what you're choosing and how you're lighting it does.
Yeah. Well, so tube cameras, again, they're very starved for light and also very limited dynamic range. So a lot of the time you were just trying to you'd have to expose for the highlights, absolutely, expose to the right with a tube camera because the clipping was god awful. It was as bad as you could possibly imagine because it would actually start to smear and highlight streaks and whatnot. So it was all about knocking
70s
down
concert
highlights.
footage.
Yeah. I mean, now looks cool. Back then,
Right.
You were struggling to hide all that stuff. So you would knock down the highlights as much as you can, and then you'd have to like pour in all this fill to bring up the other end. So you're basically squeezing everything into like 5 stops. And even then, it's a challenge to make it look good and artistic and make good choices. Underexposing on those cameras didn't look groovy in any way, shape, or form. So you would everything be right at the edge. Film, of course, certainly more forgiving in the highlights, not a ton more forgiving in the shadows, really, when it came down to it. So you were still working on, it had a lot of dynamic range, but it did crunch up in the shadows compared to what was to come after it. In the early digital cameras, still, the clip was still a bit funky, but you had suddenly all the shadow detail. So you really didn't have to use as much fill with these, what was the discovery mid 2000s or late 2000s with those new cameras. It wasn't that you didn't have to light, and they also weren't as fast as they became either. So, you were comparable to film stocks, maybe, in sort of a mid-level film stock for
Yeah,
speed.
the F900 was like 320, I think.
320, yeah, exactly. Which is funny to think now, being at 320 base seems like, for an interior, seems very slow, but at the time it was just average.
Right.
So yeah, finally when you got log, things started to, it became the highlight roll off improved significantly, and you still had all that shadow detail to play with. That it started to get very comfortable and also kind of exciting that you could start to let things underexpose. You could let the dark side of a face drop without it going a weird color. And of course, now we're just going to see more and more of that. The new Alexa adding a little bit more latitude in there is going to be really fun to play with.
I've noticed that when people talk about wanting the film look, in sort of the indie realm, they often are talking about underexposed film, like that green shadow side and stuff like that. Because perfectly exposed film, when scanned, just looks like digital.
These days it does.
Kinda, yeah.
With the digital scans and the modern stocks, I sadly I agree with you. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the point is anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, what kind of film are you replicating? People want the artifact of film. They want deep grain and goofy shadows and stuff like that. But
I mean, that's why 16 millimeter is becoming so popular, because it so clearly is film originated.
Yeah.
Versus a very clean 35 negative.
Well, and going back to what you were saying about being in the darkroom and making this was off recording, but going to the darkroom and making smears by moving the paper under the projector and all that is do you think that shooting film has do you think that sort of I don't know what's going to happen is fun, or as people like Roger Deakins would say, make you not able to sleep for 6 months? Or is that just a professional versus personal kind of thing?
I guess it depends. It depends where you're at in your career. Certainly, the experimentation process when you're younger is everything, because you have everything to learn. I'm a firm believer in learn the rules and then break them and see what happens and build your own set of rules. And having a toolbox that has everything from doing it by the book to going completely out of left field and then being able to pick and choose between them means that it's not like you're going from stodgy boring to complete anarchy. It's just that you have your own experience level all the way across the board, so you can find on the dial where any particular project falls between that. And a lot of that has to do with what kind of project you're shooting. If you're making an art project with friends, you can do whatever you want, and you should do whatever you want, right? But if you're on someone else's dime, if you're on the clock, you need to make a choice that is going to be the right one. There isn't a lot of room for experimentation, at least in my career. There are some projects and there are some DPs out there who are given much more time to try something and go, well, that doesn't work. Rip that down. Let's start again. I don't get those jobs, and I certainly would. I don't even know if I'd like it at this point because I might be a little bit thrown. I would be distrustful and go, "What do you mean I have another hour to light this set? I'm confused with this."
I got a story.
I'm sure you do, and I'm looking forward to hearing it. But so it's, yeah, to me, it's making lightning fast decisions about where in the dial are we going to fall with this, and experimentation is great if you have a backup plan that you can fall to very quickly if it doesn't work. And very often it does work, because at least for me, having been doing this as long as I have, if I feel like, boy, that's risky, but yeah, I could see how that could work, chances are it probably will. There's only so many things you can do that are really that wild, I think. I say that and I'm probably 100% wrong. I just stuff that I haven't even thought of, by a long shot.
Well, for your work on Key and Peele, did that involve, because you guys were sort of, I don't want to say aping, but you were, it sounds rude to say copying, but you were doing a lot of different types of film,
yes.
Emulating. You were doing a lot of different types of cinematography on that show. Was that all experimentation, or was that very, we're going to watch this movie, fucking dial it, and then make the thing? Because weirdly enough, that was a comedy show that had, congrats, great cinematography. It was a more professional looking show than, say, the skits on like Chappelle's show or whatever.
Right. Thank you.
There was time difference as well, but
yeah, there was. I mean, that was a decision from the very beginning. I walked into the meeting with the director, Peter Atencio, who was quite young when we started the show. He was in his 20s. And I had the references that I had. I was like, he's not going to know these. And I was also concerned because at that time, everything that was being done in comedy, the particular vogue was to shoot with crappy camcorders and make an unlit and very handheld, loose, Funny or Die, early Funny or Die, basically. And right. I was fully convinced that this young director was going to want to go that route. And in my mind, what I thought would be the most fun and also what was going against the trend would be to do what it ultimately turned into, which was, let's honor the look of the original material. Let's make it so that if someone happens to be turning on this show randomly on a going channel surfing, which, if we could still use that term, not very relevant now, but it certainly was when we aired 10 years ago, that they might start at the beginning of the sketch and not realize it was a comedy. They might think it was the actual source material until, and I, like we were talking about earlier with the Office type moves, to me, it becomes a character in the comedy. That the more you emulate the original thing, the funnier it is when the shit turns upside down. Right. And thankfully, Peter was 100% on board. He said, that's exactly what I'm thinking of. The main reference that I threw out was the Ben Stiller show from Fox in 93. Are you any familiarity with it?
Yeah, yeah.
92, I think. Which was a 1 season and out, 13 episode sketch comedy show that was shot by Russ Alserbrook, who I'd worked with a couple of times, and I just like dropped to my knees, was bowing to him. I'm like, oh my God, that show. And he sort of like bemused, like, you may get up. That was canceled after a season. I'm like, yeah, but what you did, man. Because that came out in my early 20s and I loved that show. So Peter was just like, no, that's, Ben Stiller show, 100%. And I'm like, dude, I'm just doing the math. You were like 7 when that show came. Like, what? It wasn't on DVD
even on
for
DVD?
years.
Nope.
Eventually it was. But he was just such a TV head. Every reference that I ever had, regardless of the almost 20-year difference between us, he knew everything that I grew up with, and it drove me nuts that he had such an encyclopedic knowledge of everything. But the point being that we were able to throw references back and forth with each other, sometimes just a matter of words. We knew exactly how we were going to shoot it. Other times we'd pull up YouTube clips and show them to each other. But Key and Peele was a very, very, very low budget show when it started, and it improved to a very low budget show. So we took two varies out of it. The assumption was that we got a lot more money towards the end because we really figured out how to do it cleverly. Everyone on, and that has to come all the way from the very beginning. The writers would be, taking a tour of the Universal backlot and shown locations that they could use, like the plane crash from War of the Worlds, and write a sketch around it. And suddenly we have this massive playground visually that if someone is not familiar with that, if they haven't taken the tram tour, they're like, oh my God, the budget on this show. No, it didn't cost us, a small location fee.
The Back to the Future set.
Yeah. Never shot at the courthouse for Key and Peele. Yeah, very close to it, but not quite on it. But so, yeah, every department was really figuring out how to do it on the cheap. But ultimately it came down to this unified vision of, we all loved the idea of emulating these things that we adored. I mean, and it was very emotional for me a couple of times when we got to cop from source material that was very close to my heart, especially things that got me into the industry. Like we did the end of The Shining, that was the push into the photos on the wall, the one that's Jack Nicholson, the July 4th, the period picture. We did a version of that. Okay, that's not a big deal. But the idea that I was connecting to The Shining, which is one of the most influential films on me as a teenager that ultimately turned me into a Steadicam operator, that was awesome, doing
it professionally too. Not like
right. Not
now
just
you're part of the lineage.
Around. Yeah, exactly. And when people see it and they go, oh, I see what you're doing because I recognize it from the source material, that's the joke, right?
Yeah.
I mean, also we did a Scorsese casino era base sketch where we emulated the combination dolly and zoom in that he did in Goodfellas quite a bit and around that time, and exploring it, breaking it down and trying to figure out the timing on that. What is it that makes that shot unique to him, and how did they do it? It's as simple as the dolly starts moving and then the zoom takes over, but at what speed? And we were doing it a few times, and director and I were looking at the monitor and we're like, not quite it. And the first time it happens, we both were like, there it is. And again, that feeling, where you're like, there's something I know that's very much specific to me that I really love reverse engineering. Pulling something apart and being able to honor it and recreate it, I think is really, really fun. That's just who I am. I think I get as much pleasure from that as doing something that no one's ever done before. There you go. There's me. So I was born to shoot Key and Peele, honestly.
Yeah. Were you able to get new packages for like each skit or show, or however you were kind of combining those, or did you guys have like one set of lights, a couple cameras, and that's what you used for each skit?
Yeah, it's interesting. First, I should correct you. The correct term is sketch.
My bad.
Which
sketch. You're right.
It's totally fine. Jordan and Keegan had a little. They would bring that up sometimes because people would say, "Oh, I love that skit," and they'd have to sort of grit their teeth and go, "Thank you."
Well, they're improv comedians, and they want the correct nomenclature.
Yeah, I get it. Skit is what you do in high school or something, in front of the class.
I produce a stand-up comedy show. I should know better.
Yeah, no. It got to the point where it became like that thing where you'd feel everyone would sort of go, yeah, no, we got to tell people there's sketches. But that's a very good question, and I will say that we looked into it a number of times. Peter really wanted to shoot anamorphic at the time. That would mean changing out the camera body because there were Alexa Classics later in the show to get a 4x3 sensor. So it would have been an Alexa Studio, and then the lenses. And anamorphic had already started on its swing upwards in popularity at that it still enjoys today. So cost-wise, we could never do it. I would start putting it towards the line producer, and then she'd go, nope, find another way. So we would crop 239, shallow focus with primes. We carried a few primes on the show, and then blue streak filters is how we did anamorphic. The funny thing was at the same time we were shooting that show, they were shooting the Nick Kroll show comedy series as well, and that was oh damn it, I'm trying to think. I could. He's a buddy of mine. I could say, but I can't think of the DP was. We compared notes a couple of times, and he was just like, "Yeah, I got cameras coming and going, lenses coming and going all the time." I'm like, "How are you pulling that off on that budget? That's so wild." And also, it was a combination of that, and also just mentally, it's a lot of extra work for the camera assistants. You know, it's a very different thing than pulling the same body out of a coffin every day on the set. And we shot 2+ sketches a day, all on location. So at a certain point, it's going to start chewing into the mental energy of getting the show done. So I also thought it was an interesting experiment to see how much could be done, partially in camera, but a lot in post. And we were able to emulate. What I learned from that was that the Alexa and modern digital cameras, you can emulate the look of virtually anything that was shot on film. Right. As far back as you can imagine, if you have really good color, colorists, and sometimes it leans a little bit deeper into, After Effects type work. But if you have the right vision and visual references, you can really do a lot. And we did everything from like 1930s, 1940s black and white, 50s Technicolor, 60s newsreel, et cetera, and all with the same camera and lenses.
Right.
The one paradigm where I did bring in different cameras, and this is leaning back once again. See, it seems like we're rambling, but yet we've got a common theme. My video background, I brought tube cameras in on a number of occasions. So I had these 3-tube industrial cameras from the early 80s that I picked up on eBay. And we used those for a number of sketches that were supposed to be like early 80s into maybe about 90, infomercial, live television, et cetera, et cetera. Very 4x3, crappy looking, streaking on the highlights kind of stuff. And it's some of my most fun stuff that we ever did was with those cameras. One time actually with a what's hilarious is our viewer can't see him, but oh no, they're back behind me. You can edit this out. This is more for you.
Word. Oh, nice.
Yeah. And also little home video cameras.
Nice. Is that a V mount?
A V mount?
Oh, I thought you had jerry rigged a V mount to the top of that thing. That's the viewfinder.
Viewfinder. Yeah. Oh, there's a battery. Yeah, no, it's a little weird view. Look at the little tiny eye people. I know. Again, you'll have to take this all out. But so those are the actual cameras I used on Key and Peele. And when you see that image up on the monitor for the first time, I remember the EPs all just going nuts because they're like, it's like we have a time machine between us and the actors, and you cannot recreate that digitally. I've talked to a number of post people about that and why you can't recreate the look of classic tube cameras digitally. You can try, and I've seen attempts, but it doesn't do that.
Yeah. That because what you're saying specifically, you can recreate film looks. You can't recreate like tape and tube looks. Well, maybe tape, but
tape. Yeah, but you can sample tape, but or you can just run it through tape a couple of generations, especially VHS. Because the fact is, professional tape formats didn't have a look to them. Right. That was the whole point of it. VHS Artifacts has a very specific look. But yes, streaking on highlights and smearing and all that would be very intricate to create in post and take a lot. It'd almost be like a rotoscoped effect.
Right.
So, and I haven't seen anyone bother to do it because they're like, just get an old tube camera. Winning Time on HBO was a recent show that did that. They had an Ikegami. And mine, I'm always curious because of my own experience. And so the cameras that I own and I now rent out, for those who weren't around at that era would be astonished to learn how much, how persnickety those cameras were, how much attention they required. Certainly every time you moved them and took them out of the case, you had to do a registration process with a little tweaker tool at the minimum amount. If they were exposed to too much temperature change, even loud sounds like at concerts, the tubes would go out of whack enough, and all the pots inside, everything was on a pot. There were no menus, that engineers would have to spend up to an hour tweaking them back to spec.
The pot being a dial. like a little
Yes, a little
like you'd
dial.
see on
Yeah,
a mixing board.
correct. Yeah, or a tiny little one, a screwdriver, micro
Ah,
screwdriver.
gotcha.
Through the screwdriver side. So when you take off the side of a camera of that vintage, it's like 40 pots all lined up with no legends on them. Their legend would be somewhere else. And the engineer looking at a scope and tweaking these things. And I've had my cameras. I have a guy that comes over and works on my cameras from that era, and he comes over and tweaks these things. And I've tried to learn it myself, and I'm like, good God, it's it's so much more complicated than I could even imagine. Where even this guy who know, he'd be like, "Huh, that should have done that, but it's not. Oh wait, this control should. Yeah, okay, yeah, blah 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 blah." And I'm like, yeah, things got a lot easier eventually when solid state came in, but that's all part of that look. It's I am curious though on winning time to find out if they had an engineer traveling with them because the cameras are very
They'd
fragile.
have to, right?
I think they would have to, especially the ones they used on that show. The Ikegamis were the best picture of the day, but they're the most fragile now.
That was
particular tubes.
the oh
You
my god.
think which camera it was?
No, the
HL79.
show that they shot for anyone trying to figure out what these Ikegamis were, it was Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers shot on them.
Well, almost every high-end TV show, if it outside of studios, was using those cameras. HL79 was everything for from throughout the 80s until solid state came in. Big gray and black Stuckers that just that was when I came into the business, in the mid 80s and started working. It was like, oh yeah, we got an HL79. Yeah, that's that. I never, I didn't get them from my little jobs. They were too expensive. They were too good.
Right.
But that was the cool camera, and it was a beautiful image. And even to this day, it's still there's something about it. In the same way that in the audio world, the old analog tools are revered. Some much more obscure and much less so. There is something about that Ikegami. The problem is the low resolution, unfortunately.
Right.
If they had done an HD version of that tube camera, if someone built that would be a really cool thing for someone to build today. Would be a 4K tube camera.
That would be really neat.
Wow.
The you know what I did? Now I have three things stacked up. But first being my XL2, I got a I guess it's RCA to HDMI adapter because I couldn't use the BNC because it's not. I would need a DAC and I don't have one.
Okay.
Or A to D, analog to digital, whatever.
Yes.
It's not an SDI.
Yeah.
And so I was able to get 1080 footage to my Odyssey 7Q Plus out of the XL2, and I thought that was very neat because the tape deck's broken.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I know. With all my cameras, again, here's the version of it with everything on it.
Oh wow!
And I'm sorry that the camera wants to not focus on that, but that's SDI converter on the back, Adamus on top for recording.
Yeah.
So this is now completely self-contained, but able to function in today's production world.
That's very cool. Yeah, it's fun that we can do that now. That idea would be ridiculous in like even 10 years ago.
Yeah, and it was, and 10 years ago was when we were using those, and we had to have outboard Key Pro rack mount recorders. Yeah, the version of what I did with those cameras. This has been a recent project, getting it all into the back for to make it easy, but it was a much bigger deal back then, and to the point of why we didn't do that regularly on Key and Peele, it was a lot of effort and stress for me to do that and make sure that it worked and hope that we got through the day without the thing exploding. And, so my experiment for Key and Peele mentally was to see how much can we do with one set of tools, and, countering today's mentality in terms of lenses, I shot with very neutral lenses on that show. I had the Luras, the various Allura zooms, the lightweight, Arri Alluras. Yep. We had a set of not a set of master primes. We had like 4 master primes, I think. We started with super speeds. Yeah.
3's a set.
It was a set. It was enough to get going. Usually the wider side so that we could shallow out. Once you get long enough lens, I think it becomes less noticeable. But like 135 mil prime to me is a little bit of a head scratcher because you're so shallow to begin with. I'm not sure. The optical difference
for the North by Northwest look.
Yeah. um, as long as nobody's actually moving in the frame, you're good.
Yeah.
But yeah, we started with super speeds. It's actually we had those series one speeds with the triangular
Mm.
the triangular bokeh in there, and there was one sketch early on first season where we had a lot of backlight flares and huge triangular flares in it, and I was just like, I don't know what I'm looking at. I I couldn't remember the difference between the different the speeds at that point, and those are the cheapest ones we could get because again we were we went into color and literally windowed triangle windows to try and knock down the amount of those flares because it was so distracting. Again, something that may be revered now, but I don't know if anyone's really embracing those flares. At the time, it just
No.
felt like it was in the way.
Yeah, everyone either wants super buttery no edge bokeh or really swirly Helios crazy bokeh.
Yeah.
Or like those Lomo Lomo makes some like crazy brass lenses that are interesting. I did want to ask what kind of, if shooting 2 sketches a day, how are you able to work quickly? Like what in regards to lighting, like did you have kind of a basic setup? You're like, all right, everyone plop down, the grips and gaffers know what to do. Here we go. Or was every sketch like a new plot that you guys had to draw up and that kind of thing?
It was the latter, but there was no drawing it, literally.
Mm.
The prep was so accelerated. It was so ad hoc. I will tell you that, for instance, we would shoot generally in 2 week blocks on Key and Peele, 2 weeks on, and then a week of prep, which was a lot of scouting and the usual blah blah blah. But our location scouts would be one day where we would look at like 25 locations because
Oh
of
wow.
how many sketches there were that we were going to shoot. And in a given day, each location would have at least two places within a push move that we would shoot different sketches, sometimes three. So we'd get off the van, director would go, okay, this is this sketch, we're looking this direction, this is fourth wall, give a couple of notes, and then we would have our little time. And I would say it for the first time, I wasn't out on the creative scouts. So I'd be looking at it with fresh eyes, going, okay, all right, got to come up with a scheme, cook up something as fast as I could with the gaffer. And then we had maybe I feel like it was about 10 minutes at each location to be able to do what we need, everyone giving their notes. So I'd be
Wow.
coming up with my lighting scheme, giving him the rough notes, then the location person saying, everyone back on the van, here we go, got to keep our schedule. And I'd be, literally giving notes as I was backing out the door and then going, all right, we'll figure out the rest of it on the day. Okay, bye. So really what ultimately Key and Peele was an exercise in first instinct, going with it, bare bone notes, and then doing what we could on the day, unless it was something that required a lot of intricacy, that we would put a little bit extra time into it. But most of the time, it was winging it. There was sort of an improvisatory quality to how we would attack certain things. So yes, it was not a rinse and repeat. Each sketch had its own approach. And again, part of my challenge was to see how to do that with mostly the same set of tools.
Yeah.
And also to keep it fresh. So it was not the kind of show that you would throw up the big, the 12 by book light with no fill and just kind of, blah, blah, blah. It was not that type of show generally, unless it was emulating that kind of show, in which case, yes, we would do that.
Can you, if you just could pick any sketch off the top of your head, could you walk me through kind of the, because that someone could, look up and reference, walk me through kind of how you approached the lighting when you got there? Like, were you always, or I shouldn't even say always, but was it kind of like, all right, sun's there, we're just going to diffuse it and then throw a light here, but that was always moving? Or was it truly like a la carte every single time? Was there, basically what I'm asking is was there any sort of basic, not formula, but mental tools that people could use from your experience there? Not necessarily shortcuts or cheats, but something akin to that, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, there were the sketches that were easiest to shoot were the as we call them, the two-handers. Jordan and Keegan, just the two of them bantering, which those would come up every now and then, and we knew that we would do a master coverage, maybe two sizes of coverage on either side. And the nice thing about that one would be shot listing is that, the director and I would be like, cool, we don't have to spend any time talking about that, to the point where we said we actually just need a catchphrase to describe master coverage. So it was something to do with a loincloth. I literally can't remember what it was now, but it was like the original loincloth or something. We just go, and this sketch, loincloth. Okay, next. And, so lighting with that, especially if I was cross shooting, it tended to be within the point of this is to shoot it quick and simply and give us more time it would be paired with a much more elaborate sketch. That's how we'd buy our time back. Early on in that first season, particularly, we came up a couple of times against production looking at page count and going, okay, well, this is this number of pages and this sketch is this number of pages. So we're going to split the day according to the page count. Now, if we were that second scene with the large page count happened to be a loincloth type scene, or the Obama runner that we did that was Obama speaking to the camera, which had a very specific, very simplified, both lighting and camera. In fact, that was the only set that we returned to that was built. It was a 1.5 wall flat set of flats that would be erected in all these different places that we'd be shooting the main sketch in. Like, you'd walk into an antechamber, be like, yep, and there's our little Obama set. But that may have a high page count. And they would make us, split the day based around them. And the director would be like, no, the other thing we're doing is so much more complicated. We can bang through the Obama thing. And it wasn't until we did that a few times that they actually trusted us to do 2/3 of the day on the much bigger sketch and 1/3 on the higher page count Obama sketch. Right. But getting back to the lighting aspect, it's hard to do a global takeaway because everything was different. I mean, one thing that comes to mind that's worth looking at, unfortunately, the most popular sketches, the substitute teacher, for instance, that everyone loves, that sketch, A.A. Ron.
The gifts you see, yep.
Yeah, hugely popular. Photographically, I have hardly any notes on that. I mean, I think the first one, we might have had a condor pushing light through the window, blah, blah, blah. It's just a classroom. The ones that were much more interesting visual challenges for me, or ones that I'm more proud of, are not necessarily the most popular ones. But for instance, Les Mis, we did a parody of Les Mis on one of the backlot sets at Universal. And of course, our art department, who were unbelievably brilliant and resourceful. On a larger scale set, there was only so much they could do. One of the things that was very tough for me was that movie. We were basically parodying the look of the movie, Les Mis, which
you were on the quote unquote Mexico set.
It wasn't
Pirates of the Caribbean set. I worked on the Universal backlot, so now I'm shorthanding it.
If you were to look it up, you'd be able to tell me what that one was called. We use it for a Shakespearean era sketch also. It's kind of like old European street-ish, I think.
I truly think they call that Mexico for some reason.
It doesn't. Okay. I mean, Mexico,
it doesn't look like Mexico.
The Mexican one, I think it was the Flash Flood. The Flash Flood street. That's supposed to be Mexico. So maybe it's near there.
Is it adjacent to New York?
Yeah.
It's like you walk off New York, go up like a staircase, and then it's that thing.
Yeah, it's up the hill. Yeah. I think it was European street, but any event. Good sidebar. So
for the 5 people who know what we're talking about.
So a big thing for a cinematographer as you get used to working in larger crews is being able to work with your other department heads so that you can help them, they can help you. Knowing when with wardrobe you're in a situation where you're going to be working with a lot of contrast and requesting, most costume designers are not going to arbitrarily just put a lot of white clothing on people, especially depending on skin tone. They would hopefully ask you first, but sometimes you do have to make special requests on certain things. And the same thing with the art department. In this instance, the set looked great, but the cobblestones were immaculate, and the whole look of Les Mis is this absolutely tech down, filthy environment. And the cobblestones, my lighting scheme with a big soft source above, they're going to be glowing from for the big softbox, is there any way you guys can knock them down? And they looked into it, but the cost of dirting them up and then cleaning it afterwards, time wise and so forth, it just wasn't there. So they
Right.
couldn't help me. And we ended up having to do a lot of windows in post to try to take down these glowing, clean looking cobblestones. But that was one where I went into a little bit of not an experiment so much, but I took a risk. Because the amount of work we had to do, it was a night shoot, but we never shot all night. We never shot past like 2:30 a.m. on Key and Peele. It just didn't happen. But so we had something like 6 hours to shoot this rather large scale sketch. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to have to, I can't be too precious with lighting each setup. So the Grips built a truss or speed rail rig. I don't think it was even truss. Basically a fly swatter with diffusion, and that was one of the few. I didn't often get a Condor on that show. It got shut down as much as I got approved, but that was one where I was like, it's a speed thing, we got to have it. And this is pre sky panels, LEDs were not powerful instruments at that point, again, because this is
or ugly.
Yeah, or ugly. Yeah. In this instance, I actually wanted to go a tiny bit green for the look of the movie, so it could have worked. But having to figure out what instruments to put up there that wouldn't break the bank, and I ended up speccing 5 2K blonde open face lights, cheap,
Okay.
inexpensive instruments in a pattern like you'd see on a dice. The 5, so the 4 with the 1 in the middle.
Right.
And I picked out a gel. Again, feels so quaint in this era of being able to stand on the ground and do it on an app.
The app is so good.
Yeah. In comparison, I mean, because you can sit there and go, I don't like that. A little bit more blue. So in this, looked at a few different gels, picked one out, had to like balance the color with the transmission. You'd have to look at that math and try and calculate what these instruments through that gel push through a specific diffusion at that specific height. You don't have the tools to be able to get an actual number until you actually build it. And, these being Alexas, there's only so much you can push the camera. So I was like, okay, hopefully all that will add up to enough base exposure by the time we get it up in the air. And that was one of the risks I took was, let's see, you never really want to be on the edge. You always want to have 50% more than you're going to need and dim it down. But in this instance, I was like, I don't think there's going to be any dimming. I think we're going to be full up, and hopefully it's enough. They built the thing, while the sun's still up. It went up in the air slowly. We're losing, it's at dusk. It's going up. I can see light coming out of it. I'm like, holding my fingers, and then it gets in place, meter it. It's right where I hoped it would be. Not a half a stop more, and I was like, oh, thank God. Okay, that one paid off. I mean, it's all just gut instinct at that point, based on having used instruments before through diffusion and kind of going, okay, on the ground, it would do this. Well, that's the same thing just because it's up in the air. It's just distance, it's just math. So that was a gratifying one. And if you see the sketch, you kind of go, yeah, and it's got this kind of, grungy, slightly greeny quality to it. And then we augmented with, some chimeras and things on the ground, but we got that sucker punched out in very short time. And so I felt good about that one. The only bummer for me was we couldn't quite emulate some of the looseness of that movie. They apparently shot it very, they record the audio on location, and there's the Steadicam work. There's a point where the Steadicam gets bumped in that movie. That's always was fascinating to me, and they kept it in there. Well, yeah, they just. I can't. I don't know if that was ever flagged by anybody, but I sure when I saw it in the movies, I was like, wow. And I actually told my operator, be like that, be loose, make mistakes, be sloppy, and he just didn't have it in him. And I was very tempted to go up and bang his rig during the shot just to like put that in there. But I was like, you know what? It's too esoteric a reference. No one's going to get it but us. It's just going to look like a mistake.
Yeah.
It's not, what might be noticeable to Steadicam operators or former ones in my case. It's we don't need that Easter egg. But we're actually, there's a little, speaking of podcasts, me and the production designer have joked for years about doing a podcast that's behind the scenes of Key and Peele that's all craft based, talking about the making of from all the perspective of the department heads and doing a rewatch, So you heard it here first. I don't think we'll ever get to it, but it would have been a great
that
quarantine project.
I will say that would be incredibly, like, because the start of this line of questioning really was because you guys did so many
Mm-hmm.
different styles that would be a very educational. I've said for at least 2 years on the record on this podcast, but elsewhere as well. I I want to design this. I don't know who to ask, and I don't have the skill, but I have the drive and the determination to make a some kind of DVD special features streamer. Like, I don't know how it would. I don't know if, because I can't imagine the rights for DVD extras cost very much. You know.
So describe to me what the thought what this is.
So we got streamers for all the movies, but the one thing that got me and plenty of other filmmakers into filmmaking, but also educated about filmmaking, was DVD special features, and especially the earlier ones where they were really, they weren't PR
the commentaries.
pieces. The commentaries too.
Yeah, okay.
But I think they should put commentary. See, that's an easier one. I think they should put commentaries just in the language track of like
I
Netflix
agree.
or whatever.
I don't know why they haven't. It's crazy. Yeah.
How big is a fucking audio file for an hour and a half? 200 megabytes? Like,
nothing.
They could upload that. But I want a special features streamer so you can go learn about how all your favorite movies were made.
Mm-hmm.
And in my head, it's like, well, I can't imagine the rights to those properties are very expensive because they're not the real movie. And I assume that the studios are going to go, well, no one wants that. Here, have it for pennies on the dollar. But I don't know. I don't know anything. That's just my idea.
I agree with you.
Educational streamer.
I totally agree with you on all that. And I think it would be amazing. And I think that it is a big loss for us because it was very educational for me as well. Getting a DVD and watching all of that and listening to the commentaries and learning, engrossing yourself in the movie. The only version I have of that left now, every time I watch a movie, I go on IMDb and read the trivia and get a couple of nuggets about how it was made. Even if I didn't like the movie, it's interesting to read that. That's all that we've kind of got left now from the previous experience where you just sit there and go, yeah, that was cool. Now I'm going to learn about it. So yeah, I miss all that.
I just finished Jedi Fallen Order, the video game. And when I beat it, a bunch of BTS docs opened up, and I watched one last night before I had to go to bed, and it's like 2 hours long. It's like an hour and a half long behind the scenes doc on how the game was made. And I was like, see, that's in a game. Like, what can't they should, I mean, I still buy Blu-rays like crazy. Like one of my pandemic projects was just buying every Criterion I could get my hands on that wasn't full price.
Oh, look at you.
And just a lot of educational material there. One question I did quickly want to ask is I've seen a lot of internet stuff talking, you see all these trends. I keep going like these fucking kids, but I'm one of those fucking kids. I'm on YouTube all the time. But I've seen a lot of people saying like, ooh, I just bought an Alexa Classic for $5,000. Now I'm a professional. And while we can argue about whether or not that part's true, would you these days recommend shooting on an Alexa Classic with other options available?
Specifically, an Alexa Classic, yes, I would, because as we all know, that sensor is still active in almost every camera they make today, except the most recent one. So there's a lot of, it's still a very good looking camera. It's lower resolution than what most people are acquiring at, but there's a lot of stuff still being just posted at 1080. So yes, you lose the flexibility of being able to do punch-ins and reframes, and maybe future-proofing so that you have a 4K master, et cetera, but still a very good-looking camera and not a tough workflow because it's ProRes. I think when you start going back too far, I know that there, for instance, there are some avid hobbyists who are into the F-35, Sony F-35.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's some arguments that there were certain things that were done with that camera that they veered away from in future releases, so that there may be some intangible something there mojo wise that isn't there in other cameras. But the fact is it's sort of bulky and power hungry and weird, and you can't get parts for it, and obviously it needs outboard recording. And I'm interested in reading on message boards that what these people are doing to keep those funky weird cameras that were only only a thing for a couple of years killed by the Alexa. that one seems a little bit of a head scratcher to me. And then you go even further back, like someone was just asking about the Viper, and should I,
Oof.
and I was like, that was a
No.
nightmare the entire time it existed, and it didn't look anything 2/3 inch. You're not, no, there's nothing
They
cool
shot
about.
Zodiac on it.
Yeah.
And he hated it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I thought Collateral was shot on the Viper. Apparently, a lot of it was F900 because it was so much easier to deal with. And there were just, there was a certain amount of Viper, but overall, it was just such a pain. So I think, again, leaning back to where I came from, I think that when you're looking at vintage digital cameras or vintage video, if we use the whole to describe any camera that's current back to anything that wasn't film.
Yeah.
Tube cameras are a real pain in the ass, but they're really unique looking. Once it became digital with sensors, late 80s, there's a certain look to that, like old Betacams, that arguably is worth exploring as it gets later and later, that Digibeta and then like F900 and all that. Yeah, if you want to do something that looks period late 90s into the 2000s, you could use those, but it might start to get a tiny bit subtle against, how much, what it takes to get there. I did a thing for HBO last year where it was supposed to have been originated in early 90s. I think it was TV footage, and I was pushing for the tube cameras. They wouldn't go for it. And we ended up with HDX 900s, which was, like a 12 to 14-year-old camera. And
This is the Panasonic.
yeah, the Panasonic HDX 900s. Yes, 3 chips, right? Yep.
Sounds right.
Broadcast cameras, not the HVX, but the HDX was the pro shoulder mount camera. And I dumbed them down to SD, or at least I tried to. I can't remember if I convinced them to let us shoot SD. I did a lot of tests back and forth. But I was like, you really want the look of SD in that HD master for it to look like that camera, because at a certain point it just gets too subtle. So right. I think it's cool to play around with this stuff, but it doesn't really start to look that different until you go back to, the 90s cameras like your XL.
Well, and to your point, this is actually something I was going to touch on earlier. 2 examples of that sort of emulation idea of, like, which camera for which look or whatever. I have the Twilight Zone, the original Twilight Zone, not Jordan's, on Blu-ray, and they rescanned all the original negatives and everything. And this is a show where the first episode came out before we went to the moon, and it looks like it was shot yesterday after it was rescanned. Film is an incredible medium, and people have this, like, oh, the film look blah blah blah. It's the scanning. Once you can scan a good negative, it looks modern as anything.
Yeah, and it's really, really trippy. Things that I grew up on, TV show like Star Trek, the original Star Trek. Okay,
yes,
grew up on that. Had a really good sense in my mind of what that looks like, and then when they did the HD remasters, let's forget about the CGI stuff for a second. The color and clarity, I was like, well, wait a second, because I'd only seen kind of like funky telecines of it my whole life, that just didn't capture the range of the film. So it really was bonkers to learn what was buried in that negative, and what could be extracted from it. And I think it's very interesting to see how shows kept originating in film even when there were video alternatives, because certain showrunners and producers, were like, but this is forever,
right. TNG got the same treatment, and it looks incredible.
Yeah. So yeah, there is something about that sort of reinvention of the past, but I'm all for restorations. I like finding old photos and cleaning them up, because scratches and dust and creases and all that are part of how we perceive the history. But it's really fascinating to think what it was like when that thing was brand new in someone's hand. It rolled off a printing press or out of a darkroom for the first time. That's how it was created. It wasn't created funky.
There's a great YouTube channel called Baumgartner Restoration, and this guy is a painting restorationist
Mm-hmm.
restorer. And yeah, it's fascinating to see because we think of old paintings as being kind of grungy, or not
And
grungy, but there's like a color, there's a patina. And then
yeah,
when he cleans it up, it's like, oh, white is white. It's not this weird brown green.
yeah, right. Yeah, and I think there's a place for both. I mean, if you're looking to emulate something that people can connect to as being period, lean into that. Lean into the aged look of it. Um, but at the same time, something that is truly old, bringing it back to how it was originally ingested, taken in by people. I think that that's really valid. I mean, which is kind of at odds, but there's a something along that line that I've found hilarious is if we're on location and there's a blown out window, we will do what we can to try and knock that window down so you can see what's outside, right? Or super hot screaming sun coming through, we'll try to control it to a certain extent. Most of the time, there's certain instances where you let it burn, but most of the time we'll try to control it. Then when we go on stage, we blow it out to make it look more
Right.
realistic. We'll
Right.
always let that fake sun play hotter, the window play hotter. And I laugh at that because I'm just like, it doesn't really make sense, except that it does.
Right.
Because the real thing is always going to look real no matter what you do. You can knock it down, but if you start knocking down artificial stuff, it just doesn't look real anymore.
It's like this mental gymnastics of trying to sell an idea, you know. Oh, we don't want to sell this location as just being a location. We want it to look intentional. And then you get on a stage and you're like, we want it to look like it's spontaneous.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, stuff like this, by the way, is why I adore this industry.
Yeah.
Um, because it's all play. And we're just trying to figure out which flavor of play is the most interesting to present to the viewer, but we get to have a lot of fun, along the way with these little, they're almost in jokes for ourselves.
Right.
Something else that came to mind that's a camera movement type thing. Larry McConkey, who's one of the top Steadicam operators, if not the top Steadicam operator of all time, as far as I'm concerned. I got to teach alongside with him in the 90s when I was working as a Steadicam operator. And he was telling stories, showing his classic shots, the Goodfellas Coco shot and many others with Brian De Palma, and describing his process going through how he designed these shots and all the intricate elements that he placed in there. And at one point, the characters go into an elevator, they talk, the elevator doors, come out, and he said, well, the elevator ride was actually much shorter than the dialogue. So the elevator arrived, 20 seconds into the shot, but we had to go for 40 seconds. So when you are standing in an elevator with a Steadicam on, and the elevator comes to a stop, the Steadicam will rise up or lower depending which direction you're going, because of inertia. It wants to keep going. So the operator has to kind of control that inertial feeling. If you've never seen it, it would be a little hard to describe, but it's weird. It just sort of looks like the thing is just rising up by itself because it wants to keep going the speed that it was going. Okay.
Physics works.
Physics works, yeah. It just looks weird the first time. So the operator is trying to control that, and because it's not a linear curve, it's very hard to keep there from being a little vertical bubble in the frame. So every Steadicam operator who's ever done an elevator shot knows this. Larry, because he was faking the ending of the Steadicam shot, he'd already gone through that, but now he was like trying to make it look like, okay, well, the doors are about to open. He actually inserted a replication of that move into the shot. And he goes, yeah, that was me. And my head exploded at that point, being a young Steadicam operator, that anyone was thinking that deeply about it. And that really had such a great impact on me, all these stories that he told me. And recently, there's a Scrubs podcast that Zach Braff and Donald do. There was a Steadicam shot. I did the first 2 seasons of that as the camera operator. And there's a Steadicam shot in an elevator that they were describing, and listening to it, Zach is saying, there was times when we faked it where the elevator didn't move and other times that it did, because we shot in a practical location. Scrubs was at an actual decommissioned hospital. And he goes, well, you can tell that this one was real because there's this little camera bobble when the elevator comes to a stop. And sometimes we tried to fake it, but it didn't really look that good. So this one you can tell is real. And I went and watched and went, yeah, that was we faked it. Elevator didn't move. That was me doing my bit. And I actually took that clip, married that podcast audio to it, sent it to Zach, and I was like, "Wrongo, gotcha." Because I thought that was really fun that I fooled him on that one.
Yeah. That does make me think, especially with Jordan now going off and making incredible films, and Zach is also an accomplished filmmaker and an actor and stuff. Are there anything that people like that have taught you about filmmaking that you've that's kind of stuck with you?
In other words, actors turn directors.
Sure, but just, the sort of people who have risen above their station, maybe. But yeah, just there's certain creative minds out there who I think are they got something else going.
Well, I mean, yeah. Look, how can you not be inspired by that? And I think that we've touched on a little bit of my background that I came up shooting, editing, directing, doing all of the creative jobs. I've
Your
only done
IMDb is long.
it's long and it's got a few categories.
Yeah.
When I moved out to LA as a multi-hyphenate, I learned very quickly at that time, 25 years ago, that I had to pick a lane. The industry was not particularly friendly to the idea of someone that was a bunch of different things. There was like, well, we don't know how to hire you. I feel like that has changed a lot because of technology. A lot of new people coming into this industry have a facility. They have directed, they've shot, they've edited, they've done all the jobs because there isn't a barrier to entry anymore with all of those. So I not to say I was a pioneer or anything, but it was just because I was so engaged in all these different levels of production personally that I feel like that's reflected into who I am, and I try to, and so I can bring that all to the table. So as a director, not having been an actor, that part of it, I work hard at it. But I also did have many years as a camera operator where I was essentially technically directing actors, which is as an operator, you go, it'd be great if you could just banana out a little bit here. And if you can find a reason to turn at that moment, that helps me get the shot. And that's a lot of stuff actually I learned directly from that time with Larry McConkey teaching. Was that you are allowed to and encouraged to, if you want to be really good at this, communicate with actors, but you have to learn how to approach it, especially with an actor. Some love that stuff. They eat it up. They enjoy it because it's business for them. They love that being able to integrate with the camera in a certain way. And others don't really want to hear about it, but you still have to try to figure out a way to, I'm going to say trick them into it, but I learned a lot about working with actors at that time. You inspire them to help you with the frame. So that really was when I got interested again in directing, is working as a camera operator. And in fact, I'm actually directing a couple of shorts coming up to kind of get my head back into that game a bit more. I joined the DGA last year.
Oh wow!
And so your question is, from actors becoming directors, it's always interesting watching that process. They certainly know how to or should know how to communicate with other actors. What's interesting though is to see how they embrace working with all the crafts, the technical side of it. And I have a lot of friends who I've given advice to who are getting into directing, who get very insecure about how much they should know about cinematography. And I've actually taught a couple of little classes casually for groups of people that's called Cinematography for Directors, because I'll hear the same thing over and over again, which is, I just don't know that much about lenses. And I go, well, you don't have to know much about lenses. If you can learn about them, if you can be Steven Spielberg and say, give me an 18 mil here, great. But don't worry about it if you can't do that. You do have a DP
You don't
who
need
does
the
that.
Cine Lens manual.
Yeah. You don't have to be a Stanley Kubrick who knows everything about the construction of every lens on his set. But it helps to understand what they do and why you might want a wide angle versus a telephoto at a given moment. But don't let everyone else sort of press you into thinking you need to know everything about being a cinematographer as a director, because it simply isn't true. You have bigger things to worry about. You have other things to worry about. If you bring in a cinematographer, let them do their job.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's just when you become a hyphenate, it's trying to figure out, a little knowledge goes a long way. You don't want to be overthinking the other people working for you. For instance, on the short coming up, I brought in a DP. I keep trying to switch off my brain and go, don't think about how to light it. let her do that. It's
Right.
very hard not to, but it's I have enough time before this project starts where it's very I just keep thinking about it, you know. But I think that's really what it comes down to. So for actors, they have to learn that side of it. And some, Jordan, very, very intelligent guy. It doesn't surprise me at all that he has moved in the direction that he has. He always loved the process. We had long, interesting talks on set about films, and horror films were included. We talked at length about The
Sure.
Shining. So yeah.
Yeah, because at the time of this recording, Nope just came out for
Yeah.
anyone listening. So that's the other reason why it's on the top of my mind. I did want to ask, because as I alluded to earlier, I actually knew of you originally as a name somewhere, from the DVX forums, because you had posted a bunch of stuff about Key and Peele that's still sticky there to this day. Because that was like, what, 2013, something like that.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know what your sort of point of view is on internet culture, specifically surrounding filmmaking, cinematography, that thing, as it was even just 10 years ago versus now. Do you think that, because there can certainly be a lot of poo-pooing about, oh, they don't, they have it too easy these days, or whatever it is, the old man shouting at cloud joke that I was making earlier. But has it changed, or is it different in any way? Or I know Art Adams, a colleague of mine, used to write for Pro Video Coalition, now works at ARI. Amazing guy. He's kind of backed. I was talking to him about, he's like, I can't do Reddit anymore. I can't do the forums anymore. It's just, I always get shouted down. I'm like, who's shouting down Art Adams? Because they don't know.
Yeah, I do find that a shame that there are certain people who are really the way the internet works is if you disappear for too long, you're gone. And they just, a few old timers know who you are, but the new ones aren't interested. And I think there's that sense that things keep evolving. So any piece of information that's more than 5 or 10 years old is no longer relevant, which is a little bit sad.
Right.
The trend that I would say is the hardest one to swallow is instead of experimenting and learning and researching, there's a tendency to go in and say, tell me how to do this. There's a demand for information. And there's always someone that's going to respond. The problem is there's going to be 15 people who respond with 10 different versions of the information. I don't really know what do you do at that point? You're crowdsourcing, and you're ending up, you don't know who it is that's responding. You don't know if they're right or not. And how do you pick between all those different versions of it? But I've come to realize that just doesn't really matter, because you can either do that, or you can look at YouTube videos, and who are those people putting up the YouTube videos? You look at the number of views and go, they're the bigger influencer, they must be correct. Well, that's not necessarily true either. So that part of it, I think, is a little bit discouraging, that someone who's been in the craft and has a great wealth of experience might be less relevant to a newer person coming into the industry than someone who just has the most number of subscribers and has the most popular channel. Now, it's not to say that I'm not trying to discredit those people. There's some people who know a lot about what they're doing, but how do you separate them out? Being engaging and being savvy with your SEO is not the same thing as actual knowledge in the craft that you're talking about. They don't necessarily conflate, but as far as message boards, I think that I get where Art's coming from. I'm still engaged, because I like to help and educate, and it's kind of fun to toss little nuggets around and debate with people here and there. I won't get involved in, and as soon as it gets hostile or weird, I won't engage. I won't start pulling I've been doing this for this many years, therefore blah blah blah, because there's no point in that. That just makes me sound old.
You're not going to change anyone's mind.
No, I'm not going to change anyone's mind by saying that. In fact, it's usually the opposite. So I try to keep it light, and that's why I think my lack of interest in drama is probably what has kept me around on those boards longer, and B, why people I think like to have me around on those boards is because I just I can actually try to. It's a good version of patience, to be able to exhibit. I think there is a value to that. Just in the way that teaching is not easy either. Being a teacher in a classroom, you have to put up with things and people that are difficult. So there's something to be learned from that, I think, as a human being.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about like people have, whoever has the most subscribers is correct, quote unquote. There aren't a lot of people with that sort of institutional knowledge, such as yourself, online doing the teaching. If Jeff Cronenwith had a YouTube channel, I'm sure if Roger Deakins had a YouTube channel, I'm sure it would hit. But they're busy working.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, Roger's podcast was fantastic, and inspired a lot of people. He's
inspired this podcast.
Yeah, awesome, great. I mean, ultimately, I'm at a stage of my life where I've got one foot very deeply into the sort of legacy and what's next, and what do I do with my experience, what's the most useful thing. And teaching is complicated. I don't necessarily want to at this point try to pursue teaching full time, so I do versions of it, like I said, which is maybe it's going on a podcast, maybe it's going in a message board. I'm mentoring some younger DPs now. Awesome. I'm finding all that very enjoyable, and it's not because I'm some great wealth of knowledge, but I have a lot of different flavors of experience, and some of it's still relevant.
It's like raising kids, but they go home after.
Yes, see, because you're absolutely right. I don't have any kids, so it's some version of that also. Yeah. But and the hoary old tales that we've engaged in, some of this is can make people's eyes glaze over sometimes, But I also know that this business is cyclical, so that some of these old stories may become relevant again,
Well, and I actually just recently penned out, because I sometimes will make YouTube videos for fun, or normally what it'll be is a concept that I'm like, oh, that's interesting, and then because I'm a writer, not a writer, but I write for Pro Video Coalition's, journalist, I don't know. So then I'll make a YouTube video. But one of them I kind of wanted to make was how to learn, specifically when it comes to cinematography, and part of that, for anyone listening, I can give the rundown, is like, there's way more information that's accessible on YouTube or whatever. But like you were saying, those people with all the followers, maybe they're, your, what's his face? Peter McKinnon is a photographer, right? Mm-hmm. Go to him for photography advice. Unfortunately, he's giving a lot of film advice. Not unfortunately, but so what I recommend people do is, like, I have hundreds of American cinematographers, the American Cinematography Manual. Go watch the old DVDs with the not captions, the commentaries, the making ups. Read all the American cinematographers. Then you will have a base understanding. Listen to my podcast. Then you'll have a base understanding, and you can go on YouTube and know who's full of shit and who's doing well.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And then you'll be able to filter yourself, and then you can learn. And because I'm also now trying to not instinctively go to new stuff,
Yeah, it's a challenge. Look, I mean, when we're younger, we're sponges. We love everything new and exciting and flashy and trendy, and it's all great. And then it's a natural transition as one becomes more experienced and one becomes older and transitions and different flavors of life, to kind of not be that person anymore. You don't feel, you're not in the zeitgeist automatically. Right. So it is easier, especially, in this industry, to become that kind of like grumpy old guy that we used to thumb our noses at. And it's weird to have that happen, but it is a natural progression. It's if you don't want to be, you don't want to Peter Pan yourself in this business. I think there are some people who will dye their hair and drive a fancy car and just try to play the game too long. And to me, I'm kind of like, yeah, you might get better work than me, but you are that person or you aren't that person. And I'm comfortable with the fact that I'm not going to be a superstar, A-lister, up-and-coming, hot DP. Well, I didn't go to AFI for one, so unfortunately that's not in my favor.
We've had a lot of AFI graduates on this podcast, and I'm always like, oh, really? Another one? Yeah,
exactly. So, but I am what I am, and that's really what this is all about. And I'm very appreciative of giving the opportunity and a microphone to speak, to blab for a couple of hours.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, like people can, I've said poo poo too many times, but people can maybe thumb their nose at like, oh, if I'm not an A-list DP, then I've failed. But like, you're working a lot. You've met a lot of really cool people. It at a certain point, like I keep doing industrials still, and I guess they're not called industrial corporate work, and I still find it fun. Like I got a huge snack bag the other day I did a video for a distributor for a food distributor, and they gave me a bunch of food. I work with Death and Co, the like #1 cocktail group in the world. Maybe not
Nice.
#1, but they're way up there. I get hooked up sometimes, so there's advantage.
Dude,
Life
I'll take
advantages.
that account. I love cocktails.
Oh, bro, I'll take you to Death and Co. like whenever you want. It is
Amazing.
Amazing. It's over in Arts District. Before I let you go, because I know we've been chatting for a while, I did want to touch on. You had mentioned that you're working on is it called the ZG?
Yeah.
Talk to me about that. It looks kind of cool. It's for
Yeah.
Steadicam fests, right?
Essentially, yes. The my last few years of operating, when it was the cameras we talked about earlier, the Genesis, the Genocide, and the D20, and all those cumbersome things, I started thinking about handheld a lot, and because that era was still very much, and I was working on comedy a fair amount, the handheld look was very popular. But I thought it was really silly that we were standing around with cameras on our shoulders shooting coverage for these now very long takes, which are still popular. Most comedy directors will keep the camera rolling and throw in alts and all that. And you've got operators standing still with with 40 pounds of camera on their shoulder just to give that little bit of axial shake. So at the time I came up with, I schemed up a couple of different rigs, the last of which I dubbed the ZG for zero gravity, built a couple of prototypes, thought it was pretty cool. And then at the same exact moment, decided to move up to DPing and didn't have a need for it anymore. To cut to the chase, a few years ago, I realized I should have done something with it then, but it's not too late. Went to Cinema Devices, who also make the Ergo rig and the anti-gravity device for gimbals, so they have experience with similar types of devices. And we decided to start working together and bring this thing to market. And it's a passive 3-axis cradle that the camera sits in, so you balance it somewhat similarly to a gimbal, but there's no motors on it. It terminates in a 5/8 baby pin receiver, so that it can, in the most sort of typical use of it, it will mount on a Steadicam arm. The operator can walk around with it. And the advantage there is what most people want when they want the handheld look is the axial movement, pan, tilt, roll, the little errors in those axes. They generally don't want footsteps. So the Steadicam arm takes out those footsteps. The other advantage for the operator is you've now got your 2.5 to 3 foot of boom range with the arms. You're no longer stuck operating either cradled in the hands or on your shoulder. You can now transition almost between the two within a shot. Or if you're a shorter operator shooting a taller actor or vice versa, you can boom the lens height to what you need. The other advantages are that it doesn't have to necessarily be body mounted. You can hard mount the Steadicam arm to a dolly, as we would sometimes do with Steadicam, and now you've got all that boom range still, so you can act like a operator standing and being able to adjust a few feet in either direction or go down on their knees and up and down a little bit, but you have no weight on you at all, so you can shoot for hours like that. And that's a great advantage, not only for operators and their stamina, but ultimately for directors and producers, because you don't have this time limit of how long you can work a camera operator handheld before either they get tired and have to take a break, or more typically the handheld gets more erratic.
Right.
So the beginning of the take doesn't look like the end of the take. And as a DP, I've seen that plenty of times, and I've had to reach out to them and go, we should cut. And they're like, why? And I go, because A camera doesn't match B camera anymore. B camera's
an earthquake. Yeah.
You're focusing on performance. I'm trying to keep the shit consistent for you, So, and even outside of the arm, you can drop it on a baby pin anywhere. You can put it on a tall stand. You can put it down on the ground. You get a consistent handheld look very quickly with any number of different vantage points and rigs, which there are a number of different objects out there that will recreate the look of handheld with deflated volleyballs and this and that.
I saw that on I was literally about to say that. I saw that on a pilot years ago, and I was like, that's weird. And I asked him, I was a PA, and I was like,
Yeah.
why do you have a deflated volleyball? And he goes, mimic handheld. And I was like, it's on a okay, cool.
Yeah.
Or it's on a pedestal, I guess.
Yeah. But, and it does seem strange because a lot of people, especially in the indie side, will go, well, just handhold it. And I go, right. Yes, you can always do that. And there's a place for that.
Take.
Right. But yeah, how long, if you haven't been in that scenario with a heavy rig and have to shoot for 15 minutes straight, it doesn't make as much sense until you've done that. If you're doing a doc and you're running around, handheld is still the right way to do it. But this is really more of a narrative tool. And you don't have to be a Steadicam operator to be able to use it. Even with the vest and arm on your body, we've strapped it into plenty of people who were barely even camera operators, and they're just as comfortable with it, which is really cool. So that Steadicam learning curve doesn't exist. And it has this great flexibility, as I said, that you can use it in any number of different rigs, and you get the uniform look throughout the scene, which is usually desirable. So that is the ZG. And you can go to thezg.com, ZEEGEE, to check that out.
I'll have to, we'll have to figure out, should do an article on that.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, video. It's getting out there. It's starting to get in some people's hands who are doing really cool things with it, and some big directors have had a chance to use it. And I'm hoping that it just catches on. One, because it's my baby, but two, what I feel really good about is that it's not only an interesting problem solver, it ultimately, hopefully, can help some operators with their longevity as operators and their health, and keep their body parts intact. And that's something that, even though it's not that relevant to me anymore, because I rarely operate, period, let alone, Steadicam, I don't do anymore at all. But I'm very well aware of how many people get injured on a regular basis by camera operating.
Yeah.
The big change was from film to digital, because we went from 4-minute loads to 40.
Right.
Approximately.
Right.
And that allowed the camera to keep rolling. You didn't have that automatic reload time, those built-in brakes. So I think that's made a huge difference, unfortunately, and we're only starting to see the results of it now, where people have had 10 to 15 years of doing this. And I'm hearing about younger people having more back injuries, knee, shoulder, than they used to because of this. So that's I will really feel good about this down the road if this becomes more standardized and it helps people.
Cool. Yeah. Well, we'll definitely figure out a way to do a little kind of demo for that. Because I'm the production guy at PVC. So
yay.
That's my job.
Awesome.
Well, man, thanks for giving me all that time. Super, super fun. We'll have to have you back when you get those shorts kind of shot and figured out. We'll bring them, or I guess you can just come back and shoot the shit again if you get bored. But
yeah, because we didn't even talk about cinematography all that much, which is what I love.
Frame and Reference is an Owlbot production. It's produced and edited by me, Kenny McMillan, and distributed by Pro Video Coalition. Our theme song is written and performed by Mark Pelly, and the F@R Mattbox logo was designed by Nate Truax of Truax Branding Company. You can read or watch the podcast you've just heard by going to provideocoalition.com or youtube.com/owlbot, respectively. And as always, thanks for listening.